Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, all of you, for joining us today at this special joint event. My name is Hannah Muthoni Ryder. I am the Regional Climate Change Consultant for the Economic Commission for Asia and Pacific, and also part of the Environment and Development Division, and very happy to be here to share this event with you. We have a great lineup of discussions today. We will be talking, in particular, our main focus of this event is whether 1.5 degrees is still possible and what the Asia-Pacific region can contribute to achieving 1.5 degrees. In order to get us kicked off for this event, I would like to introduce the Regional Director and Representative for the United Nations Environment Programme, Deshan Tsering, for the Asia Pacific Office. She will introduce the event to us and introduce the different speakers that we will have for this event. Thank you.
Excellency Mr. Ken O'Flaherty, COP26 Regional Ambassador for Asia Pacific and South Asia.
Okay, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the side event of the Asia-Pacific UN Regional Collaborative Mechanism, the Issue-Based Coalition on Climate Change Mitigation and Air Pollution. The Issue-Based Coalition is the UN agencies addressing the challenges of climate change and air pollution in the region. It's made up of 17 UN agencies and co-chaired by the UN Economic Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, ESCAP and UNEP. And the event is also organized by ESCAP UNEP together with UNDP, UN Women, ILO, and UNICEF. The Asia-Pacific region is responsible for over 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and as such, countries in this region will play an important role in helping reach the Paris Agreement target of keeping warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. 6 years ago, there was some progress in actions to address climate change and increase resilience, and we had 49 member states from our region submit their intended nationally determined contributions, 46 of which have evolved into nationally determined contributions, but we still have a long way to go. So while the region continues to combat social and economic challenges brought by COVID-19 pandemic, we see that we had a brief stall in emissions in early 2020, but we see that greenhouse gas emissions again back on rise. And while COVID-19 recovery spending had the potential to advance the climate agenda by supporting policies on green recovery and just transition, we found that in 2020, only 18% of recovery spending and 2.5% of total spending in 50 major economies were considered green. We also saw that G20 countries directed billions in new funds towards fossil fuel activities, much more so than they did toward clean energy. We also know that national climate pledges are not enough to keep the global temperature rise to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're on a course to warm to around 2.7 degrees Celsius with devastating impacts. So we know we need strong ambition. We know we need to raise ambition both on mitigation and adaptation. And we know the adaptation finance gap is 5 to 10 times greater than the current public adaptation finance flows. So this conference of party discussion for this side event is the 1.5 degrees Celsius target still within reach for Asia Pacific? This is the question we will try to answer during this event. We have esteemed speakers to share their thoughts on opportunities to raise climate ambition while supporting a just transition in Asia Pacific. So I would now like to invite Ibu Armida Salcia Alice Jabana, Under-Secretary General of the United Nations and Executive Secretary of UNESCAP, to deliver her opening remarks. Ibu Armida, you have the floor.
Video. Video.
Hannah, could you kindly let me know if we can connect Ibu Armida, please?
Thank you. Just about to do so.
Excellency Mr. Ken O'Flaherty, COP26 Regional Ambassador for Asia Pacific and South Asia, colleagues from UNEP, UN Women, and the UN Regional Collaboration Platform for Asia and Pacific, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this joint event that will focus on a very important question. Is 1.5 degrees within reach for the Asia and Pacific region? ESCAP, together with UNEP, UN Women, and the Green Work, has just released a regional assessment on the ambition and potential of NDC commitments of the Asia and Pacific countries. The main message of this report is that Asia and the Pacific is falling behind in its efforts. Greenhouse gas emissions are projected to increase by 34% by 2030 compared to its 2010 levels. However, given that the current contribution of the Asia-Pacific region to global greenhouse gas emission is over 60%, there is no doubt that ambitious climate action from countries is critical for achieving global carbon neutrality by 2050. The frequency of disaster in the region and the science are a stark reminder that time is not on our side and lives and livelihoods are at stake, as well as hard-earned economic development gains. Countries have no choice but to review critically current emission reduction commitments and develop long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies. It is encouraging to see that regional leaders have been lining up to make their carbon neutrality pledges. Bhutan has already achieved carbon neutrality, and the Maldives has committed to carbon neutrality by 2030. New Zealand, the Republic of Korea, and Fiji have passed bills on carbon neutrality by 2050. Australia, China, Japan, Malaysia, the Marshall Islands, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan have issued policy commitment to carbon neutrality by 2050 or 2060. During the first week of COP26, Thailand, Vietnam, and India also announced their pledges. Ambition for decarbonization is on the rise. A vast majority of countries in the Asia-Pacific region have worked hard to mainstream climate change into their legal frameworks and development plans, as well as establish bespoke climate funds. Several countries have also demonstrated that a transition to green growth can be in line with the COVID-19 recovery. Indeed, most countries in the region cannot afford to double spend on climate and recovery efforts. Furthermore, some of the lowest income countries are the most ambitious and are leading the way in terms of ambition and mainstreaming gender in climate policy. Excellencies, more work is required to develop monitoring, reporting, and verification system or MRV system. This is a prerequisite to gaining the trust of financial institutions and climate funds and enhancing the opportunities for access to climate finance. A supportive enabling framework is a prerequisite for the effectiveness and impact of any climate action. But how can we enhance further climate ambition and support low carbon development? Allow me to list some of those needed measures. Divesting from coal and fossil fuels and phasing out fossil fuel subsidies will unlock investment in growing renewable energy. Applying carbon pricing instruments will create liquidity to drive economic activity up and emissions down. Stimulating electric mobility will drive new smart city development and smart energy distribution systems. Mandatory climate-related financial disclosure will help investors direct their investment towards climate action solutions that will help manage risks associated with climate-related problems. Development of innovative financial instruments and implementation of their climate swaps can help to mobilize this additional funding for ambitious climate action. Increasing investment into nature-based solutions will reduce the vulnerability of local communities while contributing to cost-effective mitigation and adaptation efforts. All these measures are within reach for the Asia-Pacific countries. All stakeholders need to collaborate and build a strong case for decisive climate action. The time is ripe for an alliance of government, the private sector, and financial institutions to help turn the full power of the region's ingenuity and dynamism into the net zero development pathway that our future depends on. ESCAP and the United Nations regional team stands ready to assist countries in Asia and the Pacific in these efforts. Thank you very much.
I now have the pleasure to invite His Excellency Mr. Ken O'Flaherty, COP26 Regional Ambassador for Asia Pacific and South Asia, for his opening remarks. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be with you at what feels like one of the most historically important COPs for quite some time. And for us, of course, as COP26 presidency, we are determined that this must be the COP that keeps the 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive. And so it is fantastic to see the particular discussion on the contribution of the Asia-Pacific region to achieving that goal. Now, obviously, no one region can achieve 1.5 on its own, but the Asia-Pacific region is particularly important to achieving that goal. We have heard just now from the Under-Secretary General the important part that the Asia-Pacific region plays in terms of current global emissions. Asia is also, of course, the dynamo of the world economy. We have many high-growth economies within the region, and those economies need energy. And so the choices that the Asia-Pacific region makes on its energy mix, for example, will be crucial to whether or not the world meets the target of 1.5 degrees Celsius overall global warming agreed in Paris 5 years ago. The good news is, I think we would see the tide is turning within Asia. And I think a big reason for that is that the economics are changing. It is no longer necessary to choose between climate action and growth. On the contrary, countries which are now investing in renewable energy, in green tech, in clean technologies, are the ones which will see the higher rates of growth for the decade to come. Solar energy and wind energy are now the cheapest option for energy for the vast majority of countries within this region. The International Energy Agency recently called solar energy in India the cheapest energy in the history of humankind. And we are seeing countries wake up to that reality and investing in clean technologies across the region. I think it's also important to note there are other benefits to investing in these technologies. We know that in many countries within the region, pollution is a particularly big issue. And we also know that investing in solar rather than coal can deliver up to 8 times the economic benefits in terms of lower health costs than investment in coal. And I think we're also seeing progress at this COP. It was fantastic to hear the Under-Secretary General to talk about the announcements we've seen just in the last few days from countries such as Vietnam, Thailand, India around their net zero targets. We're also seeing many countries within the region make announcements around moving away from coal, and already moratorium countries such as Sri Lanka, Malaysia, the Philippines, and I fully expect to see further announcements in coming days from within this region as well. But it's also fair to say that announcements on their own do not deliver the change that we need to see. We must see concrete action within each of the economies in the region. And that's why the decisions which countries are making around their nationally determined contributions are so crucial. And so as presidency, over the coming year, we will be encouraging our partners to deliver those high-level announcements around net zero and energy mix through their NDCs, through practical action on the ground to cut emissions. But we're very clear that this is not an area where any one country can operate on its own. The international community needs to provide support to Asia-Pacific countries. For example, through climate finance, we are committed to meeting the $100 billion goal, and we are pressing our international donors hard to ensure that our Asia-Pacific partners have the support they need, both on mitigation and on adaptation. And we also need to share expertise, which is why the UK set up, for example, the Energy Transition Council, to ensure that countries have the support from investors, from donors, from international experts to help them formulate the new policies which are needed to drive down emissions. I think we are seeing concrete progress at this COP. We saw the International Energy Agency's analysis towards the end of last week that the commitments made worldwide at this COP are potentially bringing the world towards a 1.8 degrees Celsius overall global warming if all countries implement their commitments, which is, of course, a big if. As presidency, we will be encouraging other partners, notably the major emitters within this region, to follow up with further commitments and also to translate those commitments into action. But our final message would be that as COP26 presidency, we are keen for this to be a partnership, and we are committed to working strongly within this region with our partners for the year and indeed the years to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your very inspiring address and for the importance of practical, concrete action with international cooperation, financial support, and the means of implementation. With this, may I now hand over to Hannah Reiter to carry on the moderation. Hannah, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Your Excellency, for joining us. Thank you to the Executive Secretary of UNESCAP for her address as well. We're going to move on now to a second section of our event, which is really going to help us understand where is the Asia-Pacific region going in a bit more depth, and to also understand what the potential is for meeting 1.5 degrees Celsius. We will first begin going back to Regional Director Tsering for her to share with us the key results of the UNEP emissions gap report, before then moving on to a special presentation, joint presentation of a new study just released from ESCAP, UNEP and UN Women and the Green Work. Over to you, Director Tsering.
Thank you, Hannah, and I'd appreciate if you could put up the presentation. Okay. While we wait, we see the presentation. This presentation is really a brief overview of the emission gap report, The Heat is On, a world of climate promises not yet delivered. Next slide, please. So the emission gap report is an annual science-based assessment report, and this is the 12th edition. Next slide, please. So this emission gap report really zooms in on three key questions. What is the impact of submitted and announced mitigation pledges on 2030 emissions and the emission gap? What is the status of net zero emission pledges and the near-term actions and targets for 2030 aligned with these pledges? And what are the global warming implications at the end of this century? Next slide, please. So by the end of 30th September, we had 121 parties covering about 52% of global emissions, and they had communicated new or updated NDCs. And when we looked at the new or updated NDCs, we saw that the total annual reduction was about 2.9 gigaton carbon dioxide equivalent. And if you added it to the current pledges of 30th September of China, Japan, and Republic of Korea, the reductions increased to just over 4 gigatons carbon dioxide equivalent. We have not done an assessment that included India. And we saw that the 10 G20 members are likely to achieve their original unconditional NDC targets. For our region, it's China, India, and Japan. Next slide, please. So basically, the emission gap in 2030 remains large. If you look at the unconditional NDCs and announced pledges, lower emissions in 2030, it's going to be 7.5 degrees, 7.5% compared to prior unconditional NDCs. To get on track to 2 degrees centigrade, we need 4 times higher ambition, and we need 7 times higher ambition to get on track to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Next slide, please. So we also looked at the net zero emission pledges made by 50 parties covering more than half of global greenhouse gas emissions. And here again, the net zero pledges, we saw that 11 targets, if you look at the global snapshots, are in law, based in law, 24 in policy documents, 15 are government announcements. And if you looked at the G20 snapshot, we saw that 12 G20 members covering 54% of global domestic GHG emissions, 6 were based in law, 2 in policy documents, 4 in government announcements. And we saw that for the year, most were for the year 2050, with the exception of China's 26 targets and Germany's target for 2045. Recently announced net zero pledges, Indonesia by 2060 and India by 2070. Next slide, please. So we saw that the global warming implications at the end of the century under the 2030 pledges and net zero targets. I mean, if you looked at full implementation of net zero targets in addition to 2030 pledges, it would bring global warming levels closer to the Paris Agreement temperature goal. Next slide, please. But we know there is an urgent need to enhance ambition, to accelerate action, to bridge the emission gap, and to set global emission on a credible path to a net zero to keep the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement achievable. So when we start, next slide, please. And if you start to look at unabated coal-fired power generation, so well, I will just speak for a few minutes. We look at what we need to look at Asia's appetite for coal production. It doesn't sync with the Paris Agreement. And we look at the global methane pledge really as an opportunity to reduce global methane emissions by at least 30% from 2020 levels by 2030. And it would reduce warming by at least 0.2 degrees Celsius by 2050. So our region can really focus on phasing out coal and committing to a reduction of methane emissions. Thank you. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Regional Director, for providing that context for us and ensuring that we fully understand the overall outcomes of Asia-Pacific ambition and putting it into that context. Now, we will move on to a joint presentation, which will be delivered in 3 parts by the 3 key UN organizations that have contributed to it, some great colleagues from those organizations. First of all, we will have Mozarul Alam, who is the Regional Coordinator, Climate Change Program for Asia and the Pacific from UNEP. Second, we will have Aneta Nikolova, who is the Climate Action Lead for Environment and Development Division in ESCAP. And last but not least, we'll have Inka Kadrianova, who is the Regional Advisor for Gender and Climate Change for UN Women, but also based in the Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. So we will be providing these slides, and we will have different colleagues present the three sets of slides. The overall aim of this part of the discussion will be to explore what does the overarching context that Regional Director Shering has elucidated for us, what does that mean for individual countries in terms of both ambition and the potential for even more ambition? Is it realistic? Is it too much? Is it too little? Let's find out. Over to Mozarul Alam.
Dear participants, it's my privilege to begin this technical presentation on is 1.5 degrees centigrade within reach for Asia and the Pacific region. This will be followed by two of my fellow UN colleagues. We are facing the most complex existential crisis of our time. The climate crisis and the COVID crisis are making the situation worse. As discussion going on at the COP26, we tried to assess what are the countries in the Asia-Pacific region committed to and doing about the climate crisis. In this particular slide, we are showing you the growth of the greenhouse gas emission in last 1 decade. And if you notice that the emission has increased about 70% in the region, while the region has the great potential to drive the transition of the world towards a low carbon and climate resilient development, and eventually to carbon neutrality by 2050. It is also a fact that the 7 G20 members from this region are responsible for over half of the global greenhouse gas emission, and 5 of the 10 top countries have the greatest historic responsibility for emission since the beginning of the 20th century. So, what Asia-Pacific countries commit to and do in terms of the decarbonization of their economic growth, it will matter for the world. Their greenhouse gas emission reduction will tip the balance towards keeping the global temperature within the 1.5 degree. Now, if we move into the next slide, which is showing the trend of the emission since the 1990 up to the 2020, as well as the 2030 and upwards. As we all know that to limit the temperature rise 1.5 degree, we require the 45% of the greenhouse gas reduction by 2030 compared to the 2010 level. For Asia-Pacific region, this equals to a reduction in greenhouse gas emission of around 9.8 gigaton of CO2 equivalent. However, if we look into this report that we have prepared based on the submitted nationally determined contribution, as well as the carbon neutrality pledges, shows that the Asia-Pacific region is off track from 1.5 degree requirement. Rather than leading to a reduction, the current commitments are projected to result in an estimated 29.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emission in 2030, which is a threefold increase from the recommended the threshold for that year. And it represents about 36% growth from the 2010. Dear participants, let's move into the next slide, which is showing the share among the countries in our region. And when we dive deeper into the NDC commitments and the carbon pledges, we also realize that those are highly insufficient. What we need the decisive and the drastic emission reduction commitments, which with the additional climate finance and the technology would make the target of the carbon neutrality pledges more achievable. However, the aspiration to the carbon neutrality are raising, and the new pledges were added to the 34, the Asia-Pacific, the regional countries. With that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to my colleague, to take you to the next slides. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Babu. Good morning and good afternoon from good evening from Bangkok. Now, okay, we're taking this situation currently, and we did go deeper to understand what can enable actually the developing countries and all the 49 countries in Asia Pacific to move forward with more ambitious targets and pledges. And we looked and we developed something called Reinforcing Enabling Framework, which has 3 key elements. And we looked into these elements with the different factors and climate action that is grouped under these factors. And one of that is ambition factors. And the other one is enabling factors. And the third one was agenda mainstreaming. I will talk about the 2 raising ambition factors and the enabling factors. So the raising ambition factors included something that goes beyond the NDCs. Carbon neutrality pledges, and we heard that they have been increasing, and that is very fortunate that many of them come from our region. Peaking carbon emissions by 2030, looking into a higher commitments in the national green growth emission targets, also looking into the decarbonization, deeper decarbonization of key sectors, energy production, energy use, energy efficiency, management of natural resources, transportation, buildings, etc. And looking into carbon pricing instruments, application, as well as fossil fuel subsidy reform. Well, under the enabling factors, we looked also at mainstreaming climate change in national legal frameworks, in development plans, alignment with SDG roadmaps, green growth, blue economy, also low emission development economy strategies. We looked at the horizontal and vertical coordination, how are the different ministries working with each other, how they're engaging with the local government, where the action will happen, what mechanisms are there to engage other stakeholders, local community stakeholders. As well, we looked at the climate financing readiness. And that was basically looking into allocations of budgets under the sectoral ministries for NDC targets, implementation, establishing of climate funds, central development banks engagement, private sector mechanisms. And the fourth category was the transparency, the level of transparency. How good is the monitoring, reporting, verification system in each country developed? So that gave us these 2 groupings of factors, and the action taken gave us a chance to score the countries here. The overlining also factor was the integration of gender equality and human rights approaches in climate action as well, but that will be dealt by my colleague Inka Kaderjanova in a minute. So based on these factors, how are the countries scoring in our region? Let's look at the raising ambition, which is the next slide, please. When we look at the raising and the ambition, we see that the countries, the 2 big conclusions that we can make. Most of the countries are in the category of emerging slowly, and there is a lot of work to be done there. The other very key actually conclusion is that high ambition is not confined to high-income countries. We see countries like Bhutan and Kazakhstan striving for the best on the top of this line. I know you cannot see it very well. I encourage you to see the report online so you would be able to zoom into these figures better. So these countries are among the, alongside countries like Republic of Korea, Japan, New Zealand, which are scoring on the top. Now, when we go to the next slide, please, we will be able to see how are the countries scoring in terms of developing their enabling frameworks under these 4 categories that I mentioned earlier. So we see the same picture. Again, we see here that better developed enabling frameworks are not confined to the high-income countries. We see Vietnam ranked effective on the top of the ranking. And we see Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, which are at the top of their capable grouping as well, which shows us that these countries from our region, and actually the ASEAN as a whole, has a much greater potential to review its commitments and to look for more opportunities for GHG emission reductions, and we look forward to hear more about that. We also see countries like Fiji and Brunei Darussalam, which we need a little bit more support to understand, because they're with high income, but they have not been able to build their good enabling environment to support that. We also see that the countries from Central Asia and Caucasus, because of different reforms, institutional reforms and mechanisms going on, needing more support. And here regional cooperation comes forward with exchange of experience and support for that. And the overarching statement is that all countries need to look to develop better their monitoring, reporting, verification systems, which are the pillar for the enhanced transparency framework of the Paris Agreement. But more importantly, this is the most important factor that will enable more funding to flow to the countries, more investments, and more opportunities to support higher ambition and higher scoring in GHG emission reductions. Now I turn to my colleague Inka Kaderjanova, who is going to talk about the gender scoring and the overall assessment. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and greetings from Bangkok. I'm happy to be part of the side event and share pre-recorded intervention from UN Women. For the first time, gender considerations were included in multi-agency assessment report on the NDC ambition in Asia and the Pacific. While working on this report, we realized that the attention and focus on gender equality, social inclusion, and human rights considerations in climate change policy is growing across the region. The increased recognition of the links between gender equality and climate action has resulted in more gender-responsive NDCs and updated NDCs. Almost half of the countries in the region have reflected gender-related commitments and integrated gender in national policy and legal frameworks, institutional arrangements, and monitoring, accountability, and transparency systems. Such integration has the potential to deliver on social, economic, and environmental outcomes, enhance adaptive capacities, and fulfill the human rights approach while safeguarding the needs of the most vulnerable. As you can see on the slide, the Philippines, Cambodia, and Vanuatu in particular are at the top of the list. These are the developing countries which stand out in terms of their progress on gender, while the countries such as Australia, the Russian Federation, the Republic of Korea, and China are at the bottom of the list, which means that they could do better on gender and climate, given their leadership positions globally. Moving on to the next slide and concluding our presentation, I would like to encourage everyone to read the report and check the graphs and illustrations presented there. On this slide, we would like to compare 49 countries in Asia and the Pacific region based on the compound index of climate ambition and enabling factors. As you can see, the list of the top runners is diverse, and it is clear that it is not only income, population size, or even historic levels of ambition that impact the trajectory and speed of climate progress. We have 20 countries that are effectively exceeded the ambition in terms of the enabling factors that were put in place already. To give you a few examples of these countries, I would like to refer to the Solomon Islands, Kazakhstan, and the Republic of Korea. These countries have come up with the innovative approaches to climate solutions and can share significant lessons with others in the region on how to move ahead. Furthermore, this comparison shows that countries have not explored their full emission reduction potential yet. This is mainly because of the lack of confidence in available technologies and uncertainty in access to financial resources, as well as the liquidity constraints linked to the COVID-related shortfalls. We also see a group of countries that developed only a few enabling conditions, and this holds them back from demonstrating higher ambition levels. For example, this is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Turkmenistan, and Samoa. They need to make considerable efforts and will require significant financial support to increase their NDC ambition level. To conclude, we would like to highlight 4 key findings of the report. Not only high-income countries are among the most ambitious and enabled countries in the region. Secondly, most of the Asia-Pacific countries have already put in place the necessary conditions and have the capacity for climate ambition. But the gaps remain in creating effective MRV and transparency systems. And finally, it is important to facilitate cross-country learning and exchange for the region-wide increase in climate ambition. With this, I would like to thank everyone for their attention and conclude this part of the agenda for our side event.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues. Regional Coordinator Alam, Aneta Nikolova, and Inkar Kadyrovraska. Thank you so much for sharing these findings with us. And I can attest to the collegiality and the joint work, the great joint work that we did in order to deliver this report. And I really hope that those of you here participating in this event will be interested enough to go and have a look at the full report and really digest those findings. We also have a number of case studies, including countries which we'll be talking about very shortly as we move on to our panel discussion. So thank you very much for sharing those key findings with us. The key conclusions of that ambition and potential is there. It is a case of having that determination and taking forward. Now, let's move on. We'll now move on to the next part of our event, which will be and this will be your chance, dear participants, to also share your own questions with those who have already presented, and also with those who are here in the virtual and in-person room, who are ready to discuss with you what these implications really have for their own countries. So let me introduce them to you in turn before we start the actual discussion. First of all, we have Professor Yun Sun-jin, who is the co-chair of the 2050 Carbon Neutrality Commission of the Republic of Korea. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Yeah.
And we're really looking forward to your inputs on the discussion about Korea's plans and ambitions on climate change. We're also very happy to have with us Honourable Member of Parliament, Mr. Sabar Chowdhury. Thank you so much for joining us as well. Mr. Sabar Chowdhury is a Member of Parliament for Bangladesh and previously served as a Deputy Minister for the Ministry of Ports and Shipping, and also Deputy Minister for Local Government, Rural Development and Cooperatives. So both of our guests in this room really have some fantastic experience to be able to share with us on what ambition and potential really means. And last but not least, we have online Ms. Anna Romanovskaya, who is the director of the UA Israel Institute of Global Climate and Ecology in Moscow, in the Russian Federation. She became the director of this institute in 2017 and will also have some very interesting findings to share with us also about the regional work that the Russian Federation has been engaged in. So with this set of wonderful guests. Professor Sun, maybe I could begin with you and put to you the question of, with Korea being one of the first Asia-Pacific countries to announce its carbon neutrality pledge by 2050, what does this really mean for the country, and what is the strategy for real implementation of this pledge? Because it is the delivery which is very important. How is this going to actually happen?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. As was introduced, I'm a co-chairperson of 2050 Carbon Neutrality Commission in Korea. Actually, our government prepared a kind of advertisement about carbon neutrality. Why do we have such a goal and how to get it? I think it is not. It is time for us to not to say just is it possible to have 1.5 Celsius degree limit? Is it possible? We need to go beyond how to make it possible. So it is the more important. So let me show you the video made by our government first.
We have no second chance. There is no second Earth. The global climate crisis, it is 9:47. We only have 2 hours and 13 minutes.
모든 영역에서 탄소 중립을 강력히 추진해 나가겠습니다.
We should drastically reduce them. We should greatly increase them. We should quickly stop. Future changes when done without hesitation. We already know what we should do to overcome the crisis. However, speed matters. This is our last chance. 2050, carbon neutrality, coming soon.
I think this film calls you or encourages you to think about the importance of our target for 1.5 Celsius degree and how to make it. So let me shortly introduce why the Korean government maybe declared this target and how to prepare it. I think there is a time limit, so maybe I should be quickly. So as I showed you, the last year, October, the President Moon Jae-in declared 2050 carbon neutrality by 2050 at the administrative speech at our National Assembly. And then the government issued the promotion strategy for carbon neutrality by 2050, the end, maybe the December last year. And then this year, the organization I belonged to, the 2050 Carbon Neutrality Commission, was initiated. And then, you know, within 140 days, we made 2050 carbon neutrality scenarios, and we pronounced enhanced 2030 carbon national maybe determined contribution to NDC. I think at this moment, maybe many people recognize the importance of carbon neutrality to respond to climate crisis. The problem is how to make it. And you know, in Korea, we have a very controversy or oppositional position. Our NGOs, our goal, especially 2030 NDC, is too low, too weak, but our industries say it is too sudden and it is too strong. So how do we make our stance? But I think in our society and globally, we have some kind of consensus about our law. So I think it is more important to collect people's or citizens' opinion and reflect those opinions to our policy and make more strong communication between government and citizens and business. That is the reason why 2050 Carbon Neutrality Commission was inaugurated. This is a deliberation committee, but we are a kind of social channel for social dialogue. So it is composed of 97 commissioners, including 18 ministers and 77 people from our civil society and business and some youth group too, and the local government. And we have two very unique channels. One is consultation body, another is citizens council. That is, consultation body is composed of some kind of stakeholders organization. We have many times of dialogue with the stakeholders from religious group and educational group, business, labor, farmers, youth group, and local governments. And I think, or we think, lay people is also important. So we made the Citizens Council composed of 500 people. They have some representativeness from lay people based on region, gender, and age. So we give information. We think informed decision is important. So we gave information and learning and dialogue and deliberation. And then we have opinion poll and reflect those results to our policy. So we made the 2050 carbon neutrality scenario. That is a kind of future, maybe message, picture of future. So how can you imagine the society of carbon neutral? So, and we have a vision and principles, 5 principles over there. And then this is our situation. You know, our greenhouse gas emissions increased a lot, around 2.5 times compared with 1990 level. And you know, in Korea, energy sector is the most emitting sector. It accounts for 87% of our total emission. And our energy transformation and manufacturing industry are main source of greenhouse gas emissions. So we make that one into zero from 2018. That is 727.6 million tons to 0 by 2050. It is very serious. And you know, that is our draft. We announced August 5th, the draft of 2050 carbon neutrality scenarios. It was composed of 3, and especially the first one included the coal-fired power plant. So there was a big controversy. And then we, there is something missed. So finally, two versions of scenario was issued that we removed coal-fired power plant. So we do not have just 2. And this is NDC. To make carbon neutrality by 2050, we should have a very ambitious target for 2030. So 2030 is, as was announced, 40% from 2018. But you can see the table. Our target is more ambitious than other developed countries because our emission was peaked in just, we expect, 2018. So we should reduce our emission to 0 by 2050. So we think the annual growth rate or reduction rate of developed countries much milder than us, but our is very higher. So this is the sectoral reduction target. So industrial sector, the target is a little lower than other sectors because our industries heavily depend on manufacturing industry. So manufacturing, 4 major manufacturing industries emit 1/3 of our industrial emissions. So they hire people. So it is very important and very difficult. But you know, we are facing social big transition. So it means we should change all our institutional arrangement, including laws and institutions and policies and people's awareness and recognition. So we need more communication and more education and more engagement of lay people in making process. That is our current situation. Thank you. We want to maybe exercise leadership because Korea is the only country from developing country to developed country as announced by UNCTAD. So we think developing countries, especially in South Asia Pacific region, can benchmark us and we can go together. For example, our president declared the end of state funding for overseas coal, and it gives impact on Indonesia. They reduced their coal-fired power plant into half. So that kind of impact is very important. Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sun. Thank you for explaining that in depth and just the process that you're going through it sounds like what you're trying to say is this is something which we're taking very seriously, and these are the different ways that we can get to it, but also discussing with different organizations and different parts of society in order for that to happen. Now, the legislative process, Honourable Member of Parliament Chowdhury, is obviously very important to this. Bangladesh has already announced its own commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 6.7% from business as usual. As a member of the legislative body, what do you feel about this? And also having been in government previously, how do you feel about this? What kinds of legislations does it require to make these kinds of emissions reductions and even more a reality?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that question. I think, as parliamentarians, our responsibilities are not just limited to legislation. We also have to articulate the policy first. Legislation doesn't exist in a vacuum. And through your policy articulation, you are prioritizing the work of the government. And then you have a legislation to basically implement that policy. I think that's a basic thing that we do. And as chair of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, because this is something that we look after ourselves, there are a number of areas where we intervene. The first thing we did was we declared a planetary emergency. And the Bangladesh Parliament was and is still the only parliament in the world to have done that. You've got other parliaments like the House of Commons in the UK who have declared a climate emergency, because we felt that other than climate, there are also other issues which we can look at through the lens of climate change. So disaster risk is a major area. And if you do two circles, one showing climate change driven hazards, the other is other hazards, there's almost a complete overlap between disasters and climate. So that's very important. We also look at food security because as sea levels rise, we will lose almost 17% of our food production capacity. We look at water stress because you've got glacial melt in the Himalayas, and the Himalayas are the water towers for South Asia. So with increased global warming, the ice is melting. So where do we get our fresh water from? So all of these are there, and so we try to take a more holistic approach into this whole issue. We have legislation in Bangladesh already that says that 10% of our energy has to be from renewable sources. So there is already there. We have, through the planetary emergency motion, pushed the entire thrust of decarbonizing our economy. So now recently the government has announced that by 2040, 40% of our energy is going to be met from new and renewable sources. So that's a big shift. Yeah. And the NDC that you talked about, the 6% plus, that is unconditional. So, and the areas that we are looking at are basically energy. So how can we have energy efficiency, which is important? How can we move to renewables? So having the enabling policy framework, it's not just legislation. We have so many laws, and quite often you will find that you don't always implement the laws. So that's why if you have a policy, then it adds more force to the law. It sets out clearly the priorities of the government. So that's one area. We are also looking at our transport sector. So the sectors we have identified are energy, transport. We are also looking at industry. We are also looking at forestry and waste management. So these are the 5 main components that give us that. Now, if we were to receive technical support, if we were to receive financial assistance, then that will actually go up to 15%. So all in, Bangladesh is looking, conditional and unconditional, at a total reduction of close to 22%, which is very substantial. Now, when I say that, I also want to put in a caveat, because if you look at how much does Bangladesh contribute to global emissions, it is only 0.47%. So even if we were to go, 7 times, 10 times higher, it would be very aspirational. It'd be very inspiring for other countries. But in terms of making a dent, in terms of making a difference in the global picture, it's not going to be that much. But still, we want to do it. I would much rather talk about adaptation, about loss and damage. How do we stop the displacement of our communities? Because a 1 meter rise in sea level is going to displace 40 million people. And this is already one of the most densely populated countries in the world. So as a parliamentarian, we are trying to see how we can push the green agenda. Obviously, the fossil fuel is a major target for us. Bangladesh is one of the fastest growing economies. So we'll have a lot of demand for energy. Yeah. Already 10 coal-fired plant contracts have been cancelled. The government has cancelled it because we are not going to go through with it because coal is dirty. We want to embrace the new renewable energy. So that was a very powerful signal. Again, because the parliament was pushing for that. We are trying to look at the budgetary process. How can we incentivize investment in the renewable sector? How can we give more incentives for companies and the private sector to invest so that waste is no longer waste, waste is wealth, and how do we transform waste into energy? So I think we have a broad role to play there. And of course, the other biggest role that we have as lawmakers is to ensure that the governments deliver, oversight, accountability. Who actually holds the government accountable? Yes, we can look at an election cycle. After 5 years, you have an election and then the people can vote. But what happens within this 5-year period? So I think that is also integral. We are also looking at, now Article 6 is under discussion here in COP. Yes. The carbon market mechanism. So we hope we will have agreement there because the discussions as of this morning haven't really gone at the pace that we would like to. And then the question comes, how does a country like Bangladesh and even the other, small island developing states, how do we take advantage of that market mechanism? What is the capacity building that we need to do? Do we have a pool of experts that is going to help us? It's one thing having a facility in place, and the other having the capacity to actually access it, to avail it. So I think those are also areas that we will continue to look at. And Bangladesh is also currently chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And this is, of course, not just in Asia. You have them in Africa, in Latin America. But also in Asia, we have a lot of those countries. And I was just looking at that enabling framework, where you have ambition, then you have the enabling factors, and you have gender mainstreaming. I could only read the last bit on gender mainstreaming, and Bangladesh was right up there.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think that's in fact, a very powerful message. And I think the reason for that is why are countries which are not traditionally considered to be high-level income countries, why are they doing more? I think one of the reasons is they feel the pain more. And let us also be very clear, the 1.5 degrees, although that's what we are looking for, is not a perfect state of affairs. Look at the state of the world now. Even at 1.1 degree warming, look at the floods, look at the heat waves, look at the wildfires, look at the droughts. Even in Europe, America, you're having that. Yeah. I'm not very comfortable even at 1.5. because it means that we are going to go from 1.1 and it'll be another 0.4 degrees Celsius. Yeah. So the 1.4 shouldn't be a maximum. 1.5, is the absolute minimum that we need to reach. And I think all the countries in Asia Pacific should aspire below 1.5 because even at 1.1, as I've said, the pain, the suffering, the devastation, the loss, it's huge. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very good point in terms of, and it will help us move to our other discussant here, talking about monitoring and accountability. But before you do, I just also wanted to just say, this is the fact that we have two very different countries at a very different development level represented here is exactly the kind of message that we're talking about in the report and overall, that this is the ambition and the enabling is not just. There are countries who are really trying to work hard and move ahead at all levels of income, and using that for the rest of the region, and continue to build on that to have this vision is very crucial. So thank you very much for that. Our other panelist is Ms. Romanovskaya. You've been involved very much in monitoring and the review of greenhouse gas inventories in the Russian Federation and elsewhere. And the latest updated NDC for the Russian Federation does also have some ambitious targets for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. In your experience, Ms. Romanovskaya, what would you advise developing countries in particular who are wanting to increase their ambition? How can they use the monitoring and transparency to really move ahead? Those of you who are already familiar with our report and who might have looked at our report will also know that monitoring and reporting is one of the areas that is identified as a key area for progress, even more to be done across the board by different countries. So, Ms. Romanovskaya, would you have some comments? We're running a bit out of time, but I'd really like to hear from you too. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, and my pleasure to join for this side event. Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I'm not from the policy side. I'm a scientist, of course, I was not developing Russian NDC. I was mostly from the other side, who was produced a lot of critics for the Russian NDC. So I just would like to tell you probably not everybody yet knows that Russia actually. Okay, so we have such kind of NDC now. This tells like reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 to 70% relative to 1990 level, taking into account the maximum possible absorptive capacity of forests and other ecosystems, and subject to sustainable and balanced social economic development of the Russian Federation. So to say these simple words, that is not, in the view of many scientists, not really ambitious target, and it means like minus 30% to 2030 from 1990 level, but now Russia is minus 48% if taken into account LULUCF. So of course that was a lot of critics inside of Russia, and people were not satisfied with such a weak goal, because it means not reduction actually, but it means increase of emissions from the present level by 35%. So and probably I would stop here, but actually, just before the Glasgow conference, the Russian Federation adopted its long-term strategy on low-emission development until 2050. And there is something new there. And actually, greenhouse gas emissions goals are absolutely different there. So just a little bit to tell you what is in this long-term strategy. So there are two scenarios. One is inertial, so it's actually the business as usual, and the target or intensive scenario. And the latest target intensive scenario is taken as a basis. And it is going to lead to so this word is from official text to insignificant increase in emissions. So it is anticipated at least not 35% increase, but only 5%. So I would say that within the uncertainty of greenhouse gas inventory, that is more or less a stabilization target for 2030. And I have to admit that it is the most ambitious that I have ever heard in the Russian Federation, and the most ambitious that ever Russia has officially adopted. So I would like to say that it is very serious achievement, but let's hope that is not the end. It is only the start for the Russia to increase ambitions. And also, you probably have heard that our president, Vladimir Putin, just maybe a couple of weeks ago announced that the Russian Federation intends to achieve a full balance of greenhouse gas emissions with CO2 sinks about 2060 year. So here, I would like maybe a little bit to discuss.
Ms. Romanovskaya, I'm so sorry to cut you off. We will need to be wrapping up. So I think it's very clear that that there's certainly more that Russia can do. It also, the Russian Federation can do. It also comes out in the report. But I also, obviously, the work that you do on inventories and methodologies for inventories is clearly very key for being able to push up that ambition. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you very much to our panelists for their interventions and their contributions to today's event and launch. Let me now move to our final speaker, who is Deputy Executive Secretary for UNESCAP, and Kaveh Zahidi, who will give us final reflections on what needs to be done as a result, and drawing on the various contributions over this event to give us some suggestions and recommendations for the way forward. Kaveh, over to you.
Thank you, Hannah, and I hope you can hear me. I'm sorry to bring this discussion to a close, because really it's fascinating. We're seeing every angle of the conversation that is so vital for our region. But let me try to, in 2 or 3 minutes, pull things together, as you say, and refer back to the conclusions of our report as well. I mean, the first and foremost, it's very clear that our region of Asia Pacific is falling far short of the 1.5-degree ambition. This is clearly shown by our report. So implementation of NDCs, including the new NDCs and the GHG emissions reduction pledges in those, has to remain a vital first step. With that said, the high-level political pledges on carbon neutrality that we've seen now heading into or during this COP have generated critical momentum. Not just for full implementation of those NDCs, but also for moving beyond that and really moving countries onto development pathways that are truly consistent with the 1.5 degrees, because none of the NDCs would get us there at the moment. And so attention now needs to turn to what we heard from Bangladesh, the policy prioritization, the legislation, and the implementation. And while what we see in countries like Bangladesh, and it's very clear it's not just the rich countries who are moving the fastest, who are the first movers, right? And what we see in countries like Bangladesh is inspiring. And while the economics are changing fast, as Ambassador Flahadi mentioned at the beginning, it's clear that fossil-fueled economic growth, rather than NDC visions, rather than decarbonization, are still driving development in much of Asia. And here, aligning finance and investment, both public and private, with keeping temperature increase to 1.5 degrees must be what holds the key for the needed transformation. And the report touches on many of the levers of that change, including carbon pricing, including fossil fuel subsidy reforms, including, of course, freezing and phasing out coal, and using innovative financial instruments for climate action in energy, in transport, in nature-based solutions, and many of the other areas, some of which were also covered by Ibu Amida at the very beginning of our session. But it also means realigning the COVID recovery spending. In many ways, this has been an opportunity missed, and an opportunity that many countries in Asia Pacific have not managed to really capitalize. For the fiscal space opened up dramatically, but a lot of that spending went back into the old fossil fuel economy. And that was a missed opportunity that still needs the reset. Going beyond the financing, we had a very strong call in this session and in our report, of course, for the gender dimension, the gender mainstreaming. And it cannot be an afterthought anymore. It needs to be built into the transformation, as must deep consultation processes like those that we have heard about in the Republic of Korea. And finally, as our last speaker would, I'm sure, have liked to dig more into, the transparency of reporting and the sharing of experiences are going to be essential for credibility in terms of the transparency, and essential for scalability in terms of sharing of the experience. So this is the entire package that, in a way, has to move forward all at the same time. The ambassador felt that the momentum is right for COP. Our report shows that the gap, and the report of UNEP shows that the gap is still big, but I think momentum is on our side, and that's certainly what I heard, Hannah, in this event. So with those words, back to you.
Thank you so much for helping us really distill the outcomes of this event and the outcomes of what everyone has been able to share with us today, their own experiences, the results of the analysis, and also our collegiate working and sharing together. So thank you very much, Kaveh. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you participants for your time, and we look forward to engaging with you further. Remember, go to the ESCAP website, have a look at that report, download it, get into the case studies and share that experience even further. Thank you so much, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening.